Welcome back. Well, this year saw some of the highest recorded pollen counts in history, which had cities from Europe to the US covered in clouds of pollen as a result of global warming. Now, a spike in South Africa's pollen production has also been flagged by local scientists who are calling for an urgent expansion of the country's pollen monitoring program. Given the rise in pollen production globally, it has now become crucial for us to keep a closer eye on pollen as seasons worsen. Well, for more on this, we're joined from our Sea Point studios by Professor Jonny Peter, head of the Allergy Unit at UCT's Lung Institute. Professor, thank you very much indeed for coming through. So we're told now, reports are that pollen counts could quadruple in the next 20 to 30 years. I guess you could say that's nothing to sneeze at.
Indeed. Yes, so we have this data from Europe and from America where they have been monitoring pollen in multiple sites for several years. And what this is allowing them to do is really forecast what is happening. So not only are we seeing rises and this estimated figure that you're quoting there, that pollen counts will quadruple by 2050, but what's also alarming is that the levels of allergenic plants and allergenic proteins will increase in individual plant species, and then you'll get invasion of allergenic species into new areas. So for instance, there's a pollen called ragweed, which is a troublesome weed, and what's estimated is this, with global warming, this is going to invade new areas, and sensitization levels will go up from 33 million to over 80 million. Which is very alarming. The problem in South Africa is we don't know what the situation is. So we've managed to keep pollen monitoring going in Cape Town for several years, and last year with the drought, we saw 10-year highs of pollen as well, both tree and grass pollen. But long term, we just don't know. And also in other parts of the country, pollen was last monitored in the 90s. So that is really why we are drawing this to the public's attention and trying to get interest and trying to get investment and corporate sponsorship to do this, which is very important.
So just firstly tell us, in terms of some of the setbacks, in terms of monitoring, is funding one of the key issues here?
Yes, so the difficulty is that actually monitoring pollen is not so easy to do. What we do is we put a trap onto, say, a roof at about 7 to 10 meters, and this has inside it like a drum with almost like a sticky tape. And what this does is, over the course of a week, it moves slowly. We then have to take that, and then you have to have the expertise and human resources and time to look at it under the microscope, identify what grains are in the air, and do the calculations to work out the amount of pollen that's circulating. Now, unfortunately, this costs money, it costs consumables to maintain. And so this year, very excitingly, we've got 4 corporate sponsors. We've got Clicks, Thermo Fisher, A. Vogel, Kynoforce, and Twin Savers, and they are helping us to set up 7 traps across the country.
Right.
Unfortunately, this is still not covering all the provinces and other areas of Southern Africa. So we really need to keep this initiative going forward if we are to monitor and have some idea of predicting for the South African public what's to come.
Look, I want to explore this global warming link. There is, you would agree, Professor, scientific consensus. The Earth's climate is warming. About, I think, 97% of climate scientists will agree. But still, in this day and age, you have some world leaders who think that climate change is all about, just nonsense. But talk to us about the links that have been found between pollen counts and global warming.
Yes, so what they've been seeing is that essentially with the climbing temperatures, but also with the introduction of greenhouse gases, so CO2 is necessary for plant growth. So it's almost like a fertilizer, right?
Yeah.
And essentially what the data is suggesting is that the actual mass, this process of both temperature and CO2 rising levels, which I think most of the scientific community would definitely agree on, is in reality pushing up the total amount of allergenic plant pollen that's produced. It's also changing the nature of these pollen grains to the point where there's more allergenic protein that can cause symptoms in each grain of pollen. And then I also mentioned already that you're going to get new allergenic species invading into areas of the planet where they haven't been. Yeah. So what that means is that there will be spikes in allergy suffering, so particularly allergic rhinitis, and for instance what we're most concerned about is asthma. And this, for instance, was brought into quite stark relief in 2016 in Australia, where they had a conglomeration of high pollen counts and then an unusual thunderstorm. And a lot of people are attributing extreme weather conditions also to climate change. And what you saw there is within 24 hours, there were over 3,000 hospital admissions in the emergency room with asthma, and there were 10 asthma deaths. So I would say that in the context of respiratory disease, and certainly pollen-related respiratory disease, there's no question that there is a change that's occurring.
So maybe something that talks to your point with regards to climate change. We see what's happening in the Amazon as well, referred to the lungs of the earth. It supplies about 20% of the world's oxygen, and environmentalists are concerned that if it burns to a point of no return, it could turn into this dry savanna and start emitting carbon instead. And talking to that point of, plunging the planet deeper into this climate crisis, climate change crisis.
Indeed. I think that the importance of kind of gathering scientific information and scientific monitoring is that we will hopefully be able to, with more data, we've got complex modeling systems that allows forecasting. So once we have the forecasts, then we can start shouting louder, right? And this is also a political thing. So once we can shout louder, we can make a political change. And then obviously for individual sufferers, we need to, as scientific and health community, we need to look to be developing new treatments. And so we already have immunotherapy. So there are, it's not all doom and gloom. So for some allergy sufferers with pollen, we know there are some treatments that will prevent asthma attacks from occurring, and we even have immune therapy, which will allow people to, over the course of time, change their sensitizations. But what's alarming is obviously the new sensitizations.
Do we know, Professor, how many people in South Africa are sensitive to pollen?
Yes, we do. Well, we don't know exactly to pollen, but what we know from data on allergic rhinitis, which is hay fever, we know that about 17 million South Africans are affected by allergic rhinitis. That's about 20 to 30% of our population. And in addition, a significant portion of that will be affected by asthma. So if you look at those two figures, what we know then is the bulk of allergic rhinitis is driven by two things in the air. The one is pollen-related allergy and the other house dust mite. So those are the two big triggering problems. So what we can say is this is a significant problem for a sizable portion of our South African population.
All right, Professor, thank you very much indeed for giving some clarity on this very, very important issue. That was UCT's Lung Institute Head of Allergy, Professor Jonny Peter.